I'm well. I'm well. How about you?
Good.
How's things?
Oh, we were good. I just told Cheetah we have this parallax stuff starting on
Right.
Saturday, so I've frantically been putting the lectures together.
Right.
We recorded part one on it, which was good, and Ivan Illich's concept of disablement, which is pretty fascinating, and I find it a very compelling vision versus, say, Orwell and Huxley.
Hmm.
Because in Ivan Illich, like what ends up happening is, say, for example, if you can always go to Food Lion to get food, then you lose the ability to hunt for yourself. But at the same time, you don't really think of yourself as disabled because you can access Food Lion, right? It's not until you
Interesting.
can't go to Food
Yeah.
Lion that you're disabled. In fact, you're grateful for Food Lion, right? So it's kind of
Right.
funny because there's this thing that's disabling you that you're grateful that it disables you. You don't think of it as oppressing you like you do like a big brother or something like that. You think of it as a benefit. And in a way it is. I'm not saying but how do you, this is the issue. Today we have to choose our disablement. Like we have to choose what's going to disable us because we prefer to have that service provided. Like, we choose not to master hunting because, we can go to the store. So we allocate our time differently, right? And it's almost like a problem we have today is we don't realize we're constantly making choices of our disablement versus our enablement, right? We don't really realize that's going on. We're morally just like, oh, I need food today. How do I get food? Not really realizing there's something else going under all of that. And then of course the question becomes like, why learn to tell stories if you can ask Alexa to tell stories? Why learn to tell jokes if you can watch a funny movie? There's also, we know we're not able to survive in the wilderness, but there's also these skills of like being an engaging human being that we're also losing that we might not be so kind of aware of. So we've been talking about that, but
I think it's super interesting. I've been spending the last 2 years reading Hegel. Uh, Basically, I don't know. It's my current obsession, and part of what's interesting about Hegel is that he doesn't see alienation as bad necessarily. In fact, the only way to kind of grow at the very least is through alienation. I think his idea of freedom is also freedom in otherness. So one is free despite, so to speak, oppression. So it's precisely this sort of I guess it's somewhat of a what do you call that? Constraint, I think Rousseau also spoke about this, how freedom is the constraint of freedom. We get more freedom through this constraint. Yeah, so maybe we can start there. I don't know.
Well, for me, like it's an interesting question. So, Mr. Javier Rivera, good to see you, sir. And like it's an interesting question where, okay, I don't want to be dependent on Food Lion, so I'm going to learn to hunt. Well, that seems kind of silly. Is that the right response? Right? That
Right,
doesn't seem like the
right.
right response. But then in another way, it does seem like the right response. And what I think
Yeah,
what you see there is how freedom is, you're free from needing to hunt, right? Because you have access to the supermarket. Is that a good freedom? Ivan Illich is kind of suggest there's a disablement that occurs in
yeah.
that, right? And likewise, if you find freedom in otherness, I mean, you find freedom in existential psychological difficulty because the other is terrifying,
Hmm.
right? So,
Hmm.
and I think
Yeah,
like what you start to see is being human has a lot to do with kind of gymnastics with these very
yeah,
difficult decisions that,
yeah.
because if I were to ask you, hey, should we learn to hunt or not? The answer is not self-evident. Like, where do you
Mm.
go to even determine if you should? And it becomes deep. Like the hunting example is kind of obvious, but if it's like, should we learn to be able to tell stories? Right?
Right.
That one gets a little more tricky. It seems nice to be able to tell stories. You want to tell your kids stories, but then you can also watch a movie or read from a book, right? Like, how do you determine? This is what I find very interesting with Illich. How do you determine which skills you should gain and which you shouldn't? Like, by what metric do you go about that? And then, of course, it's like, are you just learning skills? And what's also the difference between enablement and like personal improvement? Because you have this fetish now on like endless personal improvement and
Yeah.
maximizing efficiency. But you know what illic is like is if you don't think about this stuff, then you become very dependent on the system,
Right.
and that leads to a sense of disablement and a lack of free. Because here's the thing: you don't feel free if you don't have ability. Like if you're disabled, right, you don't feel free. And that leads to all sorts of kind of deconstructional things. So there's these difficult choices that have I'd be curious if anyone has any response to that or anything at all.
I wonder if a dependence on system is necessarily like an effacement, in the sense of partaking into a historical reality as this metric to, I guess, bring out imminently what you are interested in. You know, like I think, for example, oh my God, I think there's a big crow. You guys can't see it, but there's a huge crow behind me. That's crazy. Uh, that's a good omen. Then I forgot exactly what I was gonna say. That's
well, definitely,
yeah.
and I'll give it to Chetan.
Sorry.
Definitely, systems are not self-effacing. Right. I guess I've been framing it in a funny way to just start because it brings to the
but
question.
I think I understand what you mean. Right?
Yeah,
right.
and
I guess.
Please.
I'm sorry. I guess it's like it's more like deciding which skill I want to preserve given the historical reality of, you know, which skills I am more compelled to like maintain.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh yeah, and I guess I'm also, and I'll give it to Chetan here, one of the ways, so it's a systems question, a technology system. Like I'm interested in the difference between, say, Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo and Call of Duty. And the reason I frame it that way is because they're both video games. So we're not demonizing video games. But like I remember on the Super Nintendo, when a game had a finite story, it had an endpoint, there was character development. And then I remember like the first time I played Halo, and I was like, oh no, this is endless. You can always get better at Halo, and it's like an infinite thing. Mm-hmm. That then almost created a dependency. Whereas I remember with Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasies, these like long RPGs, they had an endpoint, the story was over, and then I would go walk in the woods and like think about the Sword of Tribulation. There was an inspiration that came from that. Yeah, and like I've been using that to kind of explore almost the different phenomenology of those kind of tools. Like what's the difference between a shovel and a cell phone, right? They're both tools, but there seems to be differences here that are kind of like interesting to trace out. But let me give it to Chetan. Chetan, please.
All of them are extremely interesting questions, and so just sort of maybe answering the first question about violence. My sort of work on violence started with a research project that we did, and I wrote my thesis on violence also subsequently. And that research project's data and all the work we did sort of finalized into one report, but we haven't really. We've published a couple of papers from it, but we haven't really gotten it together to publish it into some kind of a book. And from there, my own sort of interest in violence and my own sort of work that I was doing parallelly, sort of thinking about questions of violence from a more fundamental philosophical lens rather than simply through the questions of data sort of emerged, and I wrote on it at that time, but it's all up in the air at this point of time. I haven't gotten the time to compile all of it into some coherent, material. Apart from that, I think these questions are extremely interesting. So one of the philosophers that I've been interested in past couple of years, I'm not reading him right now, but I was reading him like 6 months back, and and I keep on going back to him on these questions. Bernard Stiegler. So his argument actually is that eventually all technology, all some technical objects are created by some exteriorization. In Hegel also, what we look at as alienation is actually emerging from the exteriorization, that subject has to exteriorize something at all points of time in that sense. The challenge is that technical objects, say, for a long time emerge from this re-interiorization back again. That what you've exteriorized could be re-interiorized again. For instance, when you write a book, you can again read the book. You can again interiorize it in some senses. Somebody again has to do that work to understand what you've written, to be able to use it. There's a degree of interiorization needed over there. For instance, you learned how to play with fire. Now you can put a fire for the community. Now somebody else in the community also has to learn how to put the fire. there is that continuity there. The challenge with modern technology is that this interiorization is completely breaking down. You don't need to interiorize anymore. That's what cell phones do. For them, nobody needs to remember the cell phone numbers anymore. It's very small example, seems very small, but it has big impact upon how human beings see themselves. Gradually, we are becoming, which is why I always say this question of alienation has to be thought through more rigorously. Because one is this question of alienation that is important in this exteriorization process itself. You need to alienate from yourself for any kind of self-growth to happen. One is a form of alienation that is happening when you're not interiorizing that process back again. You are permanently alienated from what you've exteriorized. These two things are not the same things, which has to be conceptually worked through in some senses. You can see that, and its extreme point can be seen in artificial intelligence. The problem with artificial intelligence is not that it's more intelligent than us. The problem is that it makes us, in some senses, not needed in the equation anymore. It can become a completely automatic process. And today, interestingly, even people who made artificial intelligence telling you that do not let it become completely automatic. There is a danger there. There is a definite danger. Even the people who made it will let you know that human decisions have to remain within the technique, within the scheme of things. The problem is that human decision making slows down the process, and we do not want these processes to slow down today. There's a lot of incentive to increase the speed, so to say, because we are dealing with global systems, and faster the speed, the more globalized the network becomes. And the challenge is, how do you bring back human judgment into these globalized systems today? And we have no good answer at this point of time. And more human discernment comes into the picture, more you can slow down these networks, but the more slower they become, the more difficult they become to reach to the globalized, and there is that kind of challenge and I think in Hegel, this interiorization question was taken to be almost an automatic process. Hegel thinking was that once exteriorization takes place, interiorization will happen. What modern technology is showing us that there is no such, in some senses, guarantee over there for that to happen. And that's I think the struggle with technology today. That's where my thinking is at this point of time on this. I think there's more to say on it, but yeah.
I think that's lovely. I love this point that there's a good alienation. And it's kind of funny because someone who's never alienated from their self is kind of a jerk. They're never you don't want, if you're married to someone who never if you're married to someone who never goes, I am kind of weird. That tends to be a toxic relationship, right? You tend to have good relationships when both parties both realize they're prone to self-deception. They are kind of weird. They don't really always understand their motives. There's a certain I am not what I am, to use that Iago phrase. That's actually healthy, right? But then it's interesting because then there's a form of alienation that then seems to be more of this self-effacement, this kind of the term I'll use, this kind of you're alienated, you can't get any roots, you're wandering, and it leads to this self-deconstruction. So it's, and this is one of the things we talk a lot about, is so much of philosophy, when I think it's good and it's not trying to create some cathedral, is a measurement of decision. You're measuring, it's self-defense, and you're trying to judge, okay, I need this alienation, but not that alienation. It's more like cooking, right? You need this much salt, but, cakes, a lot of cakes have salt in it, but if you put too much salt, it's a pretty bad cake, and trying to find that measurement seems to be good. So there's some percentage of alienation that humans need, but then too much alienation and everything goes awry, right? And I think, Michelle, good to see you. And it makes me think so I really like this point as well, that process of of kind of coming out of yourself used to be more automatic just by how society was, but it's not necessarily the case anymore. It makes me think of, we talked about this the other day, banking. you know, you can do banking now all online, right? You don't have to leave your cell phone. But you see, when you had to go to the store to do banking, you might have met Farmer Fred, you might have run into the different neighbors, and I encounters other, right? And, you know, you would get social connection, but then also the encounter of the other that could help bring you out of yourself. Well, what do we do when we have technologies that allow us to basically stay within ourselves, stay in, you know, self-consciousness, not move into reason or something of this nature, right? Well, that's a different world. It's not so much a natural process. And I'll pass it to Javier. And the last thing I'll say is like, it also, like, if there are these automatic processes that are kind of infinite games, because I've been playing with infinite games to describe the game theory problems that we have now. If you're playing Call of Duty, you know, you yourself may come to a point, because you could do Call of Duty forever, right? Well, maybe after 3 years, you go, I need to stop this. You know, I've done this enough. I shouldn't devote my life to being a world-class Call of Duty player, and you can make your own individual decision to back off. But your own individual decision for that infinite game may not be the same as Fred's or Jason's or John's. Like, it could all be individuated. And this is part of the issue. It seems like when you're dealing with these infinite game technologies, you can't have a general prescription for when people should stop them. It becomes very individuated. But if it's individuated, how do you have a social order? You know, the social order becomes more difficult. And if the technologies are heading us in directions we don't want to go, how do we collectively agree on a decision that, when you rationally think about it, your reason for stopping it is more individuated in particular? That's very difficult. Like, I can use 2 + 2. I can teach mathematics and get everyone to agree eventually on a universal answer. It's 4. But when you're making like decisions when to stop infinite games like Call of Duty or global economics or something, the decision seems very, very particularized, which then how do you talk about it then? Or does that, I guess my point is that in of itself leads to a certain individualization, a certain particularization that may be like the banking, where you don't have to go, you know, you're not going out. Likewise, you're not having to reason in a manner with other people that they would understand your reasons for why you stopped Call of Duty at 3 years as opposed to 2 years or 4 years. And so there's a very interesting difference in decision making when you're dealing with those kind of infinite games that might be more particularized. I'll have to think on that, but let me pass it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Javier Rivera, I hope you're doing well and surviving school, my friend.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Yeah, Chitan raised some very good points. I'm curious. I kind of want to explore this question, because I think Matthew Stanley has been exploring it too. This idea about like the sort of wastefulness in the human being. There's something that is sort of inherently, you could say, wasteful in the human being that I think needs to be explored. I think we can see two sides of the same coin, where it's like the wastefulness of, like, let's say, boredom, and then that other side, which I don't have a name for at the moment. At least I'm losing the name. But there seems to be something that is on that kind of both sideness of the effacement and the kind of perhaps qualitatively different wasteful essence of the human being. Perhaps when we talk about like looking at art or something, I think this needs to be kind of perhaps grappled with, rather than because I think when it comes to like acquiring skills or acquiring certain things, we start imposing implicitly use value and exchange value, right? Well, then what happens with skills that are sort of, you could say, defy, you know, they don't really, they sort of deny those things. They sort of negate those things. They're not really entirely useful. They're not really entirely exchangeable per se. So I think the other issue is that what Chitan raised with globalism, it already feels like thought itself will arrive too late to steer the trajectory away from what is already happening. It does seem like the massive acceleration of globalism and technology already carries itself in implicitly with an idea that already can efface. And so the question is, how do we, because I use the metaphor of the coin, how do we flip that coin the other way around on its head? Because I think what it is fundamentally, because thought will be too late, thought can turn it over, so to speak, or turn it. I don't know if I'm making sense, but yeah, I'm going to stop there.
No, I think that's a wonderful comment. Mr. Eber, good to see you, sir. And I'm thinking about like, so on this idea of the bothness of waste. So let's say you have a wine glass and wine's pouring over the sides. There's one way in which that's an image of abundance, and there's another way in which that's wasteful. And it's kind of interesting because there's sometimes where the inability of the human to stand wine running over, that's actually a problem. Like you need to be able to like actually enjoy abundance and excess in that way. But then there's another way where letting it flow over is careless, right? So it's interesting to think that waste in one context may actually be a sign of joy or maybe a sign of festivity. And actually, this, I guess, is another question. Is it a skill to be able to discern like the difference between waste and festivity, I suppose, if I use that wine example, right? Like it's almost like different contexts could change what's waste and what's not. And there's a kind of skill there. And also what you're saying about skill falling into market. Yeah, this is why I really like Ivan Illich's notion of the right to useful unemployment, because he makes the point like today, if you decide I'm going to build my own house, like I'm not going to hire an expert, I'm going to learn to do it myself. You're seen as a deviant. You're seen as irrational. You're seen as stupid. Like, why would you even do that? And so, but Illich is like, if we live in a world where people don't develop skills outside of the market, then the only time that the human will have ability is to the degree it contributes to employment. And then if that system then that like empowers human beings is one that say is dehumanizing or pathological in different forms, well, humans are disabled to the point where the only way they have ability or value is to plug up to that very thing that's problematic. And this creates a problematic dynamic. So Illich is like, how do we think outside of that? And it makes me think, and then I'll give it to Chetan here. Like we had that conversation, like if you know, the AI is going to master rationality and it's always going to be more rational than us, then is the way that we're human is by being irrational and crazy. You know, that's how we're going to beat the AI, right? And that doesn't seem correct. But it's interesting because an angle for Illich is like, well, do things outside of like market forces, like do things that are humanizing for your own enablement, not because they necessarily create money or capital or different things like that, right? So now more has to be said on that, but it's interesting because you have this Nash equilibrium here that's being described, right? Like if you do what's rational, you're going to do that which disables you. So you have to do something that's non-rational, but why would you even do that? And by what standard do you even make the decision? But let me pass it on to Chetan. So Mr. Chetan, please.
Maybe I was saying maybe one useful distinction for what Javier is saying between, you know, useful and in that sense, waste in some senses, is this question that, you know, something that is unique, something that is particular, is something that cannot be exchanged. Exchange comes from sort of taking away from the uniqueness of the object, the particularity of the object. That is how you put it into a system. Isn't it that, you know, that is how you can create a value which is in relation to its value in comparison to other things. You're putting it, so for instance, when I say this pen is very special to me, that means I can't, the minute I sell it, that special relationship I had with the pen is not there anymore in some senses, because that's something that market cannot recognize it. You know, market cannot value it just because it was special to me in that sense. So there's a tension between in this sense something being unique and something that can be exchanged in the market, and which is why it's very interesting when these great pieces of works of art are valued in markets and put these exorbitant prices on them. And we know there's something strange to that process that takes place. You know, selling artworks, selling, you know, so on and so forth. So the challenge essentially is that you need a certain kind of realm that can survive or that can sort of resist this realm of exchange. And today we are seeing that this realm of exchange is sort of taking over or eating up all other realms. That's the kind of challenge we are seeing. And it is in that context Javier's point about useful and waste sort of comes into, I think, context. That we do not have a realm, and this realm has a name actually. We used to call it culture. Culture was a space where you created it with useless objects that didn't have immediate value in that sense. You valued them because you knew that they are sort of preserving certain of your past and certain of your future in that realm. It's not something to be used immediately by you as such. Hannah Arendt has very nice sort of essays upon this, what is culture, in her book Between Past and Present. Now, but today we are losing that realm very fast. Culture is becoming more and more social, as she would say it. Her argument would be that culture is collapsing into the social in some senses, that everything is judged from this extent that whether we can use it or not. In that context, then how do we sort of rethink this kind of a problem? You're right. Javier is absolutely right. There's no going back from here. And this is one sort of outcome of this technicization of our milieu in some senses. As the milieu is becoming more and more technicized, this is one outcome of that problem in that sense. And there's no going back from it. Then how do we position ourselves within this? I think it's interesting.
That's a wonderful comment. I'll pass it to Michelle. So something that comes to mind is, it's very interesting that story can't be exchanged. It's almost like story is some kind of surplus value of some kind. It's some sort of surplus that cannot be marketized. But it's interesting because as you were speaking on this idea that there was no realms anymore outside of exchange, culture, these things. It's interesting because what did we do? We said, story is subjective, therefore it's not real, therefore it doesn't matter. And culture is like, oh, you could be productive, you're wasting time. And so it's interesting how there was a kind of devolution of things that are subjective, which then kind of open the floodgates to let in market forces, right? So you don't have any space outside the market anymore. Mr. Stanley, good to see you, sir. And I'm looking forward to your talk with Dimitri. I see that. That'll be great. And so it's interesting. So culture became, you were being lazy, you weren't being productive. So we let market into culture. And then anything like story or subjective valuation became not real because it was subjective. So then we pushed that out. And once you kind of get rid of that, then that makes space for the cultural. And now I'm thinking, because we talked about it, at a previous net session, this might be a reason why phenomenology is so pressing, because if actually phenomenology can create a new kind of something more objective, like we were saying, because it's the shared experience itself, like that is something that can be communally shared or shared between people. And it doesn't seem as if phenomenology is so easy for exchange to take over or for the market to come in and take. And so I'm now wondering if that space outside of the market called culture, if now we're in an age where it's a kind of negation sublation of culture that has something to do with phenomenology as a new kind of shared basis for it in the way we were talking about it, I think 2 or 3 nets ago. So I'm curious if phenomenology might be an angle for a new space outside of exchange value and market forces that can bring back this non-marketable space. But let me give it to Michelle, then Javier, and then Mr. Ebert. Michelle, please.
So great to see everybody and great to be here. Don't mind me as I peel tomatoes. But I wanted to say that a lot of different things were coming to mind, but there's almost a part of me that wonders, like, why does the concept of exchange kind of get monopolized by the market? Because what if we're not exchanging enough? Like, what if we're actually not utilizing an exchange mentality enough? Like, for example, I'm cutting these tomatoes, right? I've got these like skins from the tomatoes. In the past, you could, well, not in the past, you can still compost them today, and we will. But like, if you raise animals, for example, like your waste is going to be the benefit of your animals, right? Like your chickens, your ducks, and your pigs and stuff like this. So I guess what I mean to say is, like, now we have this, I'm just thinking about like the actual waste, like when we eat something, like, do you have like the plastic bag and all these things that are like the stuff you have to throw away? And in a way, like, it does think that the fact that we can't make use of these scraps, because like there's this part of me that never wants to throw any of that stuff away. It's like, well, maybe I can use this tortilla bag as a Ziploc, and like, but then you just start like getting kind of nutsy, and it's like clutter, and you don't end up using it, and you're just like, okay, never mind. So what I mean to say is like we end up having all this waste, and we can't do anything but get it out of our sight, basically. Like we don't think of it that way, but we just put in a trash can and let somebody just take it away. We don't have to deal with that. But in the past, like our waste would have actually gone toward a lot of our waste. I mean, yes, of course, things still had like bags and things like this, but they would be like burlap sacks and hemp or different types of like materials. Or you wouldn't be, you wouldn't necessarily even be getting the packaging because, you'd just be doing more direct farm purchasing, markets, etc. So what I'm trying to say is like, I wonder if the fact that's like our waste cannot be used for anything, and that it does speak to what Chitan was saying, where there's like, oh, well, it's not useful, so like I have nothing to do with that, and that's like this very kind of utilitarian, like what's the use of it? Like, can I get something useful out of it? That does feed that, but I wonder if it's almost like pushed on us by the market because now you can go outside of it, but this is where like ILIC comes in, right? Where you have to kind of actually do something outside of the system. You have to actually, and that takes effort and time, and like you just have to try to pay your bills and like get a shower in or whatever, like. So I think that we're almost in a position where we have to throw away a lot, where that could in the past be something that would like be reused or used for animals. Like it would have been like useful waste, like. So now our waste is not useful, and we have to kind of push it away. And I guess I'm just thinking about the fact that like maybe we actually need to see things as more useful and not let the terms of exchange and use be like monopolized by the market, like the economy, if that makes any sense. So kind of out there. And then I also had a question for Javier about like what when you brought up this idea of like waste relating to humans, and what exactly was that that you were discussing there. So yeah, thank you.
No, I'll give it to Javier and then Alex. But I think it's very, ILIC talks about where now like all of these values of systemization is in the language. When you say, oh, I'm going to get an education, it automatically means you're going to go to school or you're going to get certification. If you say, oh, I'm going to make dinner, nobody thinks that means you're going to go hunt and make a fire. They're like, oh, that means you're going to go to the store, pick something. It's all in the language. And it is interesting to think that a lot of our notion of waste is relative to basically the system in different ways. We say, oh, we don't think about recycling. Like you're saying, you could make compost out of the skins. It's like, it's very like, what happens is the system makes you very linear. You say, I'm cutting tomatoes to make sandwiches. That's it. You don't realize that actually when you cut a tomato, you could arguably be seen as doing two things. I'm making a sandwich and making compost, right? There's something kind of curious I'll have to think about where there's some sort of like limiting of folk. You're trained to only think of yourself as doing one thing when you don't have a recycle mentality. And that's curious to me. And then lastly, on the notion of exchange, I think ILIC would talk about shadow work here because he would say what we're doing right now is we're exchanging, we're talking, we're creating a certain value between ourselves, but since we're not paid for it, it's deviant. It doesn't count. And actually, you guys are idiots. Why are you doing that? So exchange gradually comes to mean market acknowledgement. And if you're not doing that, you're not actually saying anything of value. Like that's a big problem. Like this whole discussion, since it's not in a college system, we would be viewed as crazy. Why are you doing this? You guys are idiots. It's like you're not exchanging anything that is market, that's making money, right? And yet for ILIC, it's a longer argument. He would say that the entire wage labor structure requires infinite examples of shadow work, exchanges outside of markets. Like the example he makes is like people have to do the work of sitting in traffic to go to work, right? That is a kind of work, sitting in traffic, but you're not paid for it. And it's not even acknowledged as labor. And, you're making data on Facebook, right? So it's actually quite a fascinating argument that we talked about on how much work is required that isn't considered work for what is considered work. And this creates a really strange kind of system, but that's called wasteful. You're being wasteful because you're talking and doing philosophy outside of a classroom. Like we're doing like intellectual work outside a classroom. We're actually being wasteful. We're kind of wasting time, right? So it's interesting how it's almost like the concept of waste is weaponized in different ways. Well, let me pass it to Javier Rivera and then Mr. Alex Eber. It is good to see your face, Mr. Javier Rivera. Look at that handsome guy. Good to see you, sir.
Yeah, so I totally like ILIC's point what you're bringing up, Daniel, about like, why would you just build a house by yourself, lacking like, if you're not like a construction worker or don't know perhaps all the intricacies or whatever, like, why that seems like such a waste to attempt to want to build a house or anything like that. Which I really like that notion, because then it kind of talks about like the pointlessness of skills, like in a good way. Like, yeah, I just want to build a house, and you know what? Maybe I don't know how to build a house, but you just want to, right? It's just like there's nothing to be exchanged for. You just want to build a house. So I like the kind of seemingly pointlessness of it from the market value that is typically placed on that skill. And I think this is when we have to talk about knowledge within the marketing system, because obviously the system wants you to participate in the system, so everything that is outside the system is perceptively apocalyptic and wasteful. And this is why I kind of focused my language on wasteful, because what I want to provoke is sort of the anxiety that is responding to this impending quote quote wastefulness, that seems to retract into itself, into a sort of infinite self-negation. And that's what, in my opinion, we have to look out for in this scenario. So I'm quite of a bit of a fan of the Nick Land argument a little bit, but I'm going to twist it in this case. I'm going to say I think we should accelerate everything to encounter the uselessness of everything, to then encounter a new qualitative change, right? That would be like flipping the coin, because I think what happens is everybody starts freaking out about like technology's taking over. What's going to be my utility in this world? How do I maintain economic anything? And I'm just like, you know what? Just accelerate into uselessness, because then that's going to provoke us to encounter anxiety and then want us to transform back what Chetan was talking about from society back into culture. Like now you have to go into culture. Now you have no choice but to either completely, annihilate yourself or go into a new qualitative culture. And I think that would be like a super fascinating kind of take to kind of like accelerate to uselessness, because I think the more that we hesitate in the system to like prevent what we perceive as apocalyptic or wasteful, that sort of helps maintain. I would say we're already in the apocalyptic and wastefulness just by trying to maintain whatever perceptible system that we're in. And I definitely agree with Marx that value is something completely mysterious and transcendent in itself. Like the moment we turn the thing into a commodity, it completely transcends what we anticipate. But yeah, that's my comment.
That's a lovely comment, and I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert and then Mr. Stanley. And I like that kind of idea of accelerating. Well, definitely what will happen is as the system becomes more AI, the role of shadow work will become more and more undeniable, and it will become more visible. And then the question will become, if you remove the plausible deniability, what's the government structure going to do? What are the people going to do? Will they rise up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And it's almost like as we move forward, there will be more of a kind of question on how do humans do things that don't seem to have a point, because you could always hire someone else to do it, or it has no market value. And I think that could also bring out phenomenology as culture. Like phenomenology becomes more critical, because if the unique way that humans frame or condition experience becomes a kind of ground of this space outside of market forces, that does seem to be something that will become more interesting. We might be forced to take more seriously as you have this technological acceleration. And you brought up Nick Land, and I always feel like I have no idea what to think about Nick Land. So I appreciate that. I listened to the Theory Underground they gave on the Thing Noumenon. I actually didn't realize he was like considered such a crazy conservative right winger. So I have to learn more. I have read Feng Numanon, but then it turns out there's a million more. Don't you love that when you find a thinker and you're like, oh, I've read. Oh, actually, there were 30 more books I didn't know they read that I haven't read. I need to get on those. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert and then Mr. Stanley. Mr. Ebert, how are you, sir?
Hello, buddies. How are you all? It's good to be here. I wrote a little. Are you laughing at me? Wonderful. That's what I needed. That's what I needed. All right, so I'm going to read something that I just wrote in response in an email because I think it relates, and I don't trust myself at this early hour to be able to represent it without reading. All right, so this relates, I think, but it may, contradict some of the possibilities of phenomenology being a sort of final bastion of difference and idiosyncratic productivity or whatever. Phenomenology is not a category. It is what mediates category. This is me speaking, right? This is my opinion. All right, so it's what mediates category, as it is what mediates base difference vis-a-vis cognitive impedances, which parse and suppress most information so that we can grasp some information as phenomena rather than all information as noumena, right? We have to, like, I'm doing this right now. I'm doing an EEG with these really brilliant coders. We're doing an EEG straight thought to music protocol, and it's really fun. So you strap an EEG machine on and then you just think, and I'm having it so that it literally just affect your brain waves affect in almost like sort of a one-to-one relationship a sine wave, and you can make the sine wave rise in tone or create more velocity and intensity with a vibrato and so on, just by thinking. So we're skipping language and we're going straight from thought to sound, thought to music. The interesting thing is, the reason I bring that up, when you take the EEG machine off, all of the values go basically infinite. They go chaotic. And what's happening is the EEG machine is reading all information when it's not on your head. When you put the machine on your head, what it's actually reading, so you almost have to look at the information upside down. What it's reading is the impedances and the impedance structure that your brain applies to all information. So in other words, your brain is an impedance mechanism which parses and impedes information such that you can actually make sense of all content by suppressing most of what is content and only allowing some content to come forth as an object or as an idea, as opposed to being flooded, right? So there's a difference between excess, and then we create the excess as the absence, so that the excess is the backdrop to the very particulars that we're beholding. So anyway, so in other words, phenomenology is not a category. It's what mediates categories. It's what mediates base difference vis-a-vis cognitive impedances which parse and suppress most information so that we can grasp some information as phenomena rather than all information as noumena, which would leave us totally dumb, right? It's that state of awe where we don't know what's happening. We're just sort of in that moment. And that's great to experience that. Both are great. All right, so anyway, though fundamental, this process itself modulates to produce different phenomenological states. This modulation in general abides by energy preservation laws and death drive. So phenomenology itself is abiding by protocols that attempt to minimize the amount of that attempt to economize the energy of phenomenological experience, right? So my theory, I guess, and I think I can now just sum up the email, but my theory, the working theory, is that if phenomenology is what's responsible for difference, and phenomenology is abiding by energy preservation laws, then all of our efforts, actually, you know what? No, I still haven't drank enough coffee. I'm going to continue to read. All right. Though fundamental, this process self-modulates, death drive to produce the least. All right, so this modulation in general abides by energy preservation laws to produce the least energetically taxing phenomenological state possible over time. But even more importantly, all of the categories of human production work to attempt to minimize phenomenological variance to maximize phenomenological efficiency and redundancy. We want to maximize, in other words, phenomenological efficiency and redundancy. So and so this is exactly contrary to what you were saying, right? It's like, so all the things we're doing, right? We're turning the beautiful little barista in Italy into a Starbucks to homogenize and create redundancy so that every city we go to is the same city, every experience we have is the same consistent experience, and all of that may actually in fact be in service of phenomenology. So that phenomenology and phenomenological efficiency is actually what's driving, because when we think about experience, right? And the experience of going from one Arby's to the next Arby's, that's an experience. Going from one city to the next city and you feel like you haven't left, that's an experience. And so all of these homogenizing factors are working in effect to collapse the experience of space and time, right? So I feel like I haven't toiled for months in a covered wagon to get from New York to Los Angeles. Instead, I feel like I've only spent a couple hours in the air, right? I'm collapsing the phenomenological experience of spatiotemporal values, right? And all of these technological innovations are perhaps and maybe in service of actually collapsing phenomenology itself. So that what we end up experiencing, this is why I always say that, you know, we're actually shallow beings, like fundamentally shallow, and that in fact human depth is actually just a scaffolding on top of a base shallowness created by suboptimal and inefficient human productions. And the more we optimize and the more we get efficient with our capitalist and technological innovations, the more efficient the algorithm, the more it reveals to us that depth was always just a byproduct of inefficiencies. And the more efficient we get, the more shit pop music, K-pop we end up consuming because we actually want nothing. We actually want no difference, right? Anyway, I'll go on for a second. This is the same process of unbounded blah, 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 and maximize phenomenological efficiency, redundancy. This is the same process of unbounded optimization, the same McDonald's hamburger every time you go, any location, the same city, no matter what city you're in. Progress is the collapsing of difference, which is to say the collapsing of phenomenology. So as the human process of energy optimization continues across historical paradigms vis-a-vis technological movement, phenomenological states not only move in tandem, but inform and reinform that technological movement. So instead of saying, oh, it's the technical that's impeding the phenomenological variance that is fundamental to experience, and we always experience difference, and everything is this potpourri of experience, and that's the fundamental thing, and technology is impeding the phenomenological, and what we need to do is turn to the phenomenological to reinform the technological so that the technological can again express itself in the multitudinous, you know, variegated form, very colorful experience, right? But rather, what if that's not the case? What if technology has always been in service of the energetic requirements for energetic phenomenological efficiency? And that what we've all been doing this entire time, what the death drive really is the collapsing of difference. And by difference, we really mean phenomenological difference, because that is the difference of experience, or the experience of difference. Therefore, the capitalist phenomenological state is different than the feudalist, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that's really all I wanted to say, is that it's possible that the phenomenological and phenomenology, yes, is absolutely central and crucial, and in fact so central and crucial that actually if we really study it, perhaps what we see is that it is the driving force of every single paradigm that we can think of, every economic paradigm we can think of, the collapsing of difference across technological yada yada. So anyway, yeah, I just want to throw that out there, that it may not be our savior, but it's at the very least like our key to understanding why this is happening.
Excellent, Mr. Ebert. And thank you for getting up and being here at the net and doing what you're doing. And I liked your glasses. And I think it is completely critical to realize that phenomenology, in the same way that everything has both-sidedness, we cannot say that phenomenology is inherently good. The question is the following: can phenomenology be conditioned? Because our very experience of reality, when it is unconditioned, tends to go into the direction of, like you say, reducing energy, harmonization, reducing difference, so that we don't have anxiety. The issue is that often when we've spoken about objectivity and subjectivity, we've spoken about objects as if you can work with objects, you can change objects, so on and so forth. While subjectivity is very flimsy, it's something where you experience and there's nothing you can quite do about it in different things. It is very clear that phenomenological experience naturally goes into what I will call low order causation, which tends to reduce complexity, reduce energy use, and belonging again to, we'll talk about discourse. We tend to organize ourselves according to the zeitgeist and the discourse and experience reality in a manner that conforms with the discourse. That leads to all of the different harmonizations that you were speaking about. The question is the following: if we talk about phenomenology as a basis for a non-market space, it won't just magically be that. But is phenomenology something we can condition or improve, like going to the gym? So for example, and this is where we'll talk about conditionalism, like right now at the net, is this some kind of phenomenological training, actually? Are we actually conditioning ourselves to experience differently than if we didn't do, say, the net or philosophical conversation, right? Now, it's very clear that the net doesn't fall into, say, market valuations or different things. And it easily might be that phenomenological conditioning are things that are outside of market forces and are not things that are readily marketed, which would actually suggest that a lot of the shadow work is precisely what is needed so that phenomenology doesn't go in the direction it naturally goes in, which is conformity, commoditization, and letting itself be carried. And the other key to this is that technology seems to work on our experience of reality. And then if that technology is reducing, energy use, for example, or reducing difference, then we also experience the world in line with that technology, so that we don't see as much difference and these things get easier and easier on us. Well, this would mean we have to choose the way we use our technology in a manner that doesn't condition our phenomenology in a low order direction. We have to change how we use it to maintain what I'll call high order causality or conditioning that is more able to take in, say, fuller experience. Now, that's a broad term, and belonging again to has to go into all of that. But one of the reasons why phenomenology as a field might be very interesting to discuss as this area outside of market is because although it is not naturally going to go in the direction of not being captured, can it be conditioned to work better away from that? And that would be the question of, is that something that a net conversation does? Is that something that philosophy does? Is that something that art does when you're outside of market forces? Is there a kind of, it's like the distinction we're asking, what are these skills that you can't get paid for, or these skills, like Javier said, that are kind of outside of market forces? Would this be something that falls in line with conditioning our phenomenological experience? And for me, everything that you just said, Mr. Ebert, suggests that the game is live. Like, you are being conditioned right now. The way your brain works wants to make things homogenize, reduce energy, actually fall in line with market forces, right? And so you can't choose not to have your brain do that. But if you are aware that your phenomenology is heading you in that direction, can you then condition it to head in a different direction or to have different forms of experience? Or like Layman Pascal was saying, more nutritious experiences. Mr. Ebert, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, this is where boredom becomes really crucial, without boredom, which is another phenomenological experience, it's the experience or the self-relating negativity, to put it in Hegelese, of the self as non-dynamical, of the self as fully efficient, and the boredom and the realization that pure peak is a plateau, in fact, right? And that as soon as we realize that peak is a plateau and boredom sets in, that's our savior. And so if anything, cultivating a higher sensitivity to boredom would be in order. Like, if there was any savior, it's some, it's like heightening our sensitivity to the non-dynamical, heightening our sensitivity to the moments in which things have gone dead, and understanding them as bliss points gone flat. Do you know what I mean? And so that moment of boredom is totally crucial. And yet, you know, I also want to just reflect this, is that there's nothing wrong with the non-dynamical. And it's always everyone's knee-jerk, of course, to presume, especially anyone Western, to presume that any socially non-dynamical, homogenized, flattened existence is, of course, bad and anti-life and non-vital. But what if even non-vitality itself is not bad? What if the general premise that we seem to be saddled with regard to energy preservation, free energy minimization, negentropy, this drive to equilibrate everything, to get to equilibrium with every fucking thing we do. What if that's not bad? What if we rolled with the river instead of against it for a moment, just as a thought experiment? And I think that that's actually probably the most challenging thing to consider. And you know, in that Nick Landish way, I guess, or at least, you know, the one concept that Nick Land presents, which is totally Hegelian, which is based, you know, accelerationism, which just means, well, if you want the next paradigm to come, just go ahead and exhaust this one, because there's no other way to the next paradigm. Simply no other way. And so, yeah, once you exhaust it, you become bored and you start the next oscillations. But I don't know. You know, all we wanted was a return to the non-dynamism of the womb. And yet when we get there, we're like, this is bad. This isn't real living. Maybe there's something to be considered within that. Maybe it's not actually bad. Maybe we just need to go ahead and embrace the sort of the flat line. I don't know, but I know boredom holds some answers there, and I think boredom really should be studied, like on a neurological level, like the moments of boredom, what precipitates boredom, how boredom functions, and what boredom has to do with technological progress and human innovation. Anyway, yeah.
It's an excellent comment. I'll pass it to Matthew, Stanley, Javier Rivera, and Jason. There's a wonderful book, one of my favorite, by Patricia Spox, on the history of boredom as a concept, and it doesn't arise until the 18th century with the Great Enrichment. You don't see it in literature. You don't see characters talking about it, and then you have this explosion of boredom. So it's very clear that boredom tends to arise with progress. But you see, this would actually mean, I think, to your point, what we need to do as human beings is learn to roll with it, per se. When equilibrium arises, well, that arose following Miss Spax precisely because of wealth. You want to get rid of wealth? No, what you want to do is figure out how do we, to me, this is why we emphasize conditioning. You want to be conditioned to never get stuck. If you're in dynamicism, you don't want to be stuck needing dynamicism. If you're in equilibrium, you don't want to be stuck at equilibrium. You have to have the conditioning to, dare I say, sublate, negate, sublate, threshold, whatever arises. Like, you have to be able to roll with it. And that's where we emphasize with the class on the difference between plan and prepare. Like, you're prepared for equilibrium, you're prepared for dynamicism. You're prepared not to need to go back. You're prepared to take whatever you hit and go with it. And I think definitely there's a danger. What you see here is if you say, oh, equilibrium means we did something wrong, which means you go back, that's a problem. But if you hit equilibrium and say, oh, this is a new situation to condition to, that seems, but then the question is, how do you condition? What does that look like? Let me give it to Matthew, Stanley, Javier Rivera, Jason, Andrew Luber. It's good to see you, sir. Mr. Stanley, I like your red coat. You have a really cool background. I like when you were walking through the city. I felt like I was with you. It was in a movie or something. Mr. Stanley.
Hey everybody. I wanted to throw back to Javier's comment about building houses, because I think it's important to keep in mind that the market for in which exchange takes place is never just it's never just the market, but it also requires a government structure to sustain and to create markets. Markets are pretty at the very lowest level of guaranteeing contracts, for instance. You can't exchange. At least, people aren't going to be incentivized to exchange unless they know that their contracts are going to be enforced, that they can, trust other people. But what I was thinking about in terms of building houses is that with technological advancement, we've so raised the level at which you can start a project. Like with the rise of, as we get better at building homes, the state mandates certain ways that homes have to be built. And so what you begin to have is you have all of these impediments to experimentation, and you have all of these impediments to the development of folk knowledge, folk ways, and people are like, in the name of protecting people against risk, we've taken away the ability for people to be able to build something that's good enough. For instance, so like you see the homes that people build in Africa, or, people are getting by, they're living, they're okay, but then we also see slums catching on fire and things like that. So like we understand that there's risks there. And I think back to the Code of Hammurabi, where basically a construction worker, if you build a home for somebody and it falls on them and kills their son, your son gets killed. So instead of mandating the way that a house is supposed to be built, they basically just said, hey, if you build a shitty house and it comes back to bite your customer, it's going to come back and bite you too. And so there's this interesting way in which that by pushing the risk back onto the person who does it, instead of mandating the ways it has to be done, you kind of suffocate or squelch in the baby basket, like all of the possibilities of people experimenting, trying things, building their own home. I would just briefly point out there, I don't know if anybody follows County Line Notes on Substack, but there's a guy named Randy who lives in upstate New York who's really cool. And he's been writing about illegal cabins, and I'm dropping it here, but he's been writing a series about squatting. And basically talking about like techniques for squatting. Every single state in the US actually has squatting laws. Here in California, for instance, if you inhabit a property continually for at least 5 years, then you can actually legally sue to take ownership of it. So every single state has the ability to squat on property, to build a cabin on property, to continuously inhabit it, and then to actually even take ownership of that property in the absence of the owner. So just things to think about. There's all of these sort of experiments of being able to just build a home somewhere, of just being able to build your own vehicle to get around. They're all being they're precluded at the outset by the existence of massive government infrastructure to license and to inspect, to maintain all these sort of things. So instead, moving away from the metaphysical sort of reflections there, to me, that's the kind of thing that I think of, the very specific political structures, because those are the things that are within our power to change. Those are the things that we collectively wake up every day and decide we're okay with this system, and we continue to do it. So anyways, that was kind of my contribution.
I think that's a wonderful contribution. And now Michelle and I know how we're going to start our great real estate empire, one squat at a time. And so the monopoly board spreads. I'm really, Ivan, I'll pass it to Jason, Javier Rivera, Chiton. I think what you're getting at is very important, because Ivan Illich is all about these systems of disablement, government, where if you do this, it's illegal, so you're in trouble. And basically the point is, like, it would seem to me the more we have a society that avoids risk, the more we as human beings are not conditioned to be capable of, say, rolling with equilibriums, boredom, wealth. We become very, we're disabled. So when something's going for us, we get attached to it, and then it can become a pathological relationship. And so there's something to here that a risk society, and like you're saying, where instead of making sure there's a difference between law that makes sure that nothing bad happens, as opposed to law that says there are consequences if something bad happens, right? Now, those can overlap, and we're not saying one is good and one is bad, but there's something about a society, for Illich, that doesn't allow risk-taking, that will result in people not being conditioned in a manner that will help them, well, for him, be fully human, and to not, say, get into various ruts, like I think that Mr. Ebert was pointing to. But again, risk is scary. We don't like risk. Please.
But what I think is going on is that, like, where we're trading micro risks, you know, obviously a house falling and killing a family is not a micro risk in their existence, but what we're doing is we're trading all of these micro risks for macro long tail risks.
Yes, I agree.
Because what's going on is, like, if for some reason there was, like, we're building our lives on technologies and structures that we don't understand and couldn't replicate, and so we're actually putting ourselves into the hands of greater risk, where we could go from technology to nothing and not know what to do at that point, where, you know, like, I don't know how to build a house because I've never had to, and there's a bunch of rules for how professionals are supposed to do it. And so if I was in a situation where I did, I would have a pretty steep learning curve to figure it out, you know, both figuring out how to acquire the material, put it together, the structure. And so the point is that by pushing our risks out into the future, into some, like, macro level catastrophic risk, we then get to enjoy kind of the day-to-day conveniences that come with that.
1000%. To be very, very general, basically, for example, in economics, what we've done is taken a lot of micro risks and debt, and we've made a giant global debt bubble that's so big if it popped, it would kill us all, so it can't pop. And likewise, that's what we've done. We've traded micro risks for big risks, and then we make the risk so big that if they fail, we all die. So then we don't have it. So then it becomes a kind of game theory dynamic where no one's going to blow that risk up unless some black swan occurs that forces it to blow up, and then we're in trouble. That's what we did with nukes, right? That's what we've done with debt. That's what we've done with modern goods and services. That leads to this giant, too big, too bad to happen situation, right? And that's how we're trying to, yeah, we know we're creating a giant macro risk by trading these micro risks, but if that macro risk is too bad to happen, then we don't have to worry about it happening. We'll see. But then, of course, the problem is, what if the situation that allows you to have that avoidance of all the micro risk with a macro risk that's too bad to happen leads to mass disablement, mental health problems, techno-feudalism? Oh, crap, we've locked ourselves into that then. So, you know, and this gets into the, you know, the Austrian Keynesian debate. This gets into all sorts of different things. But the point you made is very good. I'm going to pass it to Jason, Javier, and Chetan. Jason, please.
Saying that's unbelievably interesting stuff with the squatting law. I will also have to look into that. I guess I would like to comment a little on what you said earlier about phenomenological conditioning. You know, I wonder if what's important is to pay attention to the passage from phenomenology as a state, you know, phenomenological state, to doing phenomenology, which is to say, you know, considering the objectivity of the subjective and the subjectivity of the objective, you know, so you're not really bogged down by questions that contain abstractions such as, oh, this is external, contingent, more real, you know, matters more. I think it's interesting to see how one thing twists and turns into the other. And this movement, I think, it is a kind of working out, as you said earlier. I do think that, you know, it is a kind of working out of the mind, you know, or the spirit, maybe. And I think the lesson is to accept the paradox that we must meddle with the autonomous, but also this could equally mean getting used to the autonomous, meaning that you can also let things pass. You know, by letting things pass, sometimes that is a form of rebellion. So yeah, I think, I mean, I'm ending it at a kind of aporia here, you know, where but I think there is something to be said about the maintenance of a paradox and the passage from, yeah, the isness of phenomenology, meaning, yeah, this noumenal realm being parsed out by the brain into this very specific phenomenal slice, let's say, to doing phenomenology, and I think that's, there's all sorts of metaphysical implications in a person doing that in reality itself, I don't know. Anyway, I guess I'll stop there.
No, it's an excellent comment. I'll pass it to Javier and Chita. I mean, is it a way to condition your experience of the world to experience paradox differently? Whereas before it's unbearable, now it's an opportunity or something you can hold without a pathological response. Now, the question becomes, I mean, we can go through language now. Is that phenomenology or is that psychology? Is that training of is that emotional intelligence? Like, there is an argument to be had here where we'd have to go through and, in reconstructing, like, the differences between these kind of things. Does all of these fall under phenomenology? There's also a question of, if you experience like this laptop right here, if I was addicted to the computer, versus not, or use it like an instrument, like Bonita Roy was saying with Ivan Illich, where it's something that enhances humanity. So the difference between the laptop replacing humanity versus extending humanity, same laptop, same subjective experience, and yet there's something else that is different in the quality of the experience of the laptop that seems different from the mere subjective experience of the laptop, unless under the category of subjective you include emotion as well. This is where it gets tricky, right? It's like, that's where there's a different quality of experience. Can you condition that? Naturally, without conditioning, we head, say, toward addiction, right? Or we head toward our tools replacing our humanity. Can we condition ourselves to change it? And if so, is that the grounds for the non-market space of community and relation, to train that, to think about that, to get better at that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You're not going to get paid for it, so you're a deviant to do it, following Ivan Illich, and yet it seems really important. But I'm going to pass it to Javier Rivera Chiton and then Mr. Andrew Luber. Mr. Javier Rivera, please.
Yeah, I think Ebert said some really good points, considering like boredom and the sort of villainization of homogenization. Villainizing homogeny. I think Emile Cioran is actually very useful in this sense, because he wrote a lot about boredom, uselessness, and the history of decay. And it's funny because he talks about how civilization ends when we've exhausted all the thinking that it was already implied to create the civilization. Which is why I like to kind of jokingly, and I'm almost like a kind of like trickery kind of way, embrace what people would view as apocalyptic. Because I think that's exactly that transition, or like that peak point that we need. Now Ebert's point on like, maybe we want this like flat line, I think is very fascinating, because what it reveals is two types of homogenization. I think the ultimate homogenization is fundamentally death. If we're taking like entropy seriously, it's funny, it's like that interior homogenization that is happening out of fear of death increases the disorder around it, meaning that it perceptively looks to the subject as if the threat is always outside. The threat is the apocalypse, the systems crashing, the futility of the human being, the uselessness of skills, and the increasing technology, everything like that. But what's funny is like, that is actually you could say the hellish perception that is supposedly external, that is actually the paradise itself. But what is happening is paradise is progress for everybody. So it's this homogenization of efficiency, which is ironically death. On the interior, it's death. But if we were to transition it to the, like Ebert said, go with the flow, go with the river, that is sort of embracing the sort of entropy that is already happening, meaning that it's going to look apocalyptic, which we can't perhaps eradicate that. It's going to look apocalyptic, but it will be paradisal in its nature. This is kind of flipping and turning hell and heaven kind of on each other, because I think what is happening is this interior, this protective shell that we're doing, is the homogenization of efficiency that Ebert is talking about, or as the disorder still is happening around us. But it's the systems that we're creating is sort of used to protect it. But what's happening, like Stanley's talking about, is like we're trading micro risks for macro risks. And that is exactly what's happening, right? We're interiorizing the homogenization, but the long term leads to death and annihilation anyways. So how do we go with the flow of what perceptively looks like apocalyptic and a wasteland on the looking at the outside? How does that change that? But yeah,
I think everything you're saying is very, very good. For Ivan Illich, we had lost the art of dying. And as a result, because we didn't know how to die, we didn't know how to live. And basically what we did is, to escape death, we gave everything over to systems, became disabled, and now we don't know how to die. And as a result, we don't know how to think, because you don't know how to think unless you're able to think death, because that frames everything, right? So there's something, and the apocalypse can have that function as well in that way. And I think, like, also on this notion of flat lines, like in sociology, like with belonging again, without givens, humans go crazy. Without any degree of homogenization or shared intelligibility, we lose our minds. But then if we only have that, we're oppressed, and that's totalization, banality of evil, and all these frames. So you need releases, but then if you have pure release, and it's all dynamic and stuff, it can be chaos and nobody understands one another. But there does seem to be different levels of kind of harmonic equilibrium. There's a world where we can all be the same as Nazis. There's a world where we can all be the same as not Nazis. There's a world which we can be seeking our harmonize. I can't say words. Words are hard. A equilibrium in terms of something that's more open than not. But it's interesting because even if you get these different kinds of equilibriums, and I hesitate to say better because, that's a moral language, but let's say different kinds of equilibriums, they can be a new kind of threshold, as Ebert kind of will talk about with freak theory and different things. And so, but it is interesting because it does mean we have to have the ability to go with the flow whenever we reach a new equilibrium, that we're able to then sublate it. But what do you do if the system is keeping you from being conditioned and capable of that? Oh, and by the way, if the system fails, since that would be too bad to happen, it's incredibly dire, maybe even apocalyptic, right? And for me, that's what we try to argue, kind of in belonging in what has occurred, is you have a system now that has this disabling ability, which makes it difficult for us to run with it. But if that system is torn down, that can lead to a lot of really big consequences that would be very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible to overcome, but it's too bad to happen. And how do you exist in a macro disabling system that's too big to fail? Basically, bringing together Leopard Co., Ivan Illich, and all of these different, and of course, that opens a lot of doors. But a lot of questions. But let me give it to Chetan, Mr. Luber, and then Mr. Ebert. Chetan, please.
So first, I think Michelle's sort of comment upon this question of exchange was very interesting. And I think the question that we are trying to ask, what she's trying to sort of pose over there is, what is it about the market that it doesn't allow other forms of exchange to, exist outside of all exchange sort of becomes, in some sense, totalized by the market. What is it about the market that sort of keeps on playing that role in our times? I think from there, maybe we can, I want to sort of get in conversation with Javier's question of acceleration. He's quoting on Nicoland, and from there, what Ebert was sort of saying. If I may sort of maybe sort of think from it from a different perspective in some senses, with a little kind of a maybe have a little disagreement on it in some senses. I agree. I think to the extent that there is a point about sort of being in relationship with your own death, in some senses, and that's what acceleration is about. In some senses, that that if this has to happen, you get in relationship with that, you get in touch with that, and there is a point to that. The problem with the acceleration question is, I think, which we need to maybe think more seriously about. And I would like to sort of go back to psychoanalysis question over here. When we think about death drive in psychoanalysis, we think of death drive as something singular which is heading towards its own inorganic state. But if you sort of really read Lacan properly and you read your Freud, you realize that death drive is not this singular entity at all. that drive in itself is a very plural concept where how you inhabit it makes it different. That is why Freud was very early on saying that you have to find new ways of dying. It's not simply about dying, isn't it? That if it was a simple question about reaching your own death, it's easy. I don't think that is why death drives should not be confused with death also. It's about, as Panchik would say, finding new ways of inhabiting your death. It is in that newness that something comes about, which is why when you get into therapy and you look at somebody who's repeating his symptoms, you do not simply say, oh, you keep on repeating your symptoms unless you reach the deadlock. That argument doesn't work in a therapeutic space. That is why you have psychoanalysis. Otherwise, you wouldn't have psychoanalysis at all, isn't it? So that's, I think, the first background in which this acceleration philosophy has to be thought through, because acceleration philosophy is not giving you a new way to inhabit your death. In fact, it is, if I may say so, it may be in some senses, for lack of a better word, it may be something which is creating a certain background of fear of your own death in which it is happening. When you're scared of something, one way is to avoid it. The other way is to just accelerate it. If you can see it, if something bad is going to happen to you, and the one is to avoid it. But if you know you can't avoid it, what you do is you create a certain form of acceleration towards it, because that is how you will inhabit that state. Given it is in that, say, taking from here, and if he thinks about Ebert's question of phenomenon and noumenon, and something going in the background, something coming in the foreground, and Ebert's point that when everything becomes same, there is I don't remember his words exactly, but there is some kind of movement which needs to be respected, needs to be sort of affirmed, than simply fought against. The challenge actually is there, a very interesting one, and I'll just say that and maybe not talk too long, but challenge there is very interesting. What if this tendency that everything can go into the background actually brings everything into the foreground? And that's the problem of psychosis, which we are not able to think about. The problem of ego in some senses. If you think about this question of identification in Lacan, especially this question of identification with image, you look at his mirror stage and those, and you look at the symbolic problems, questions something bringing into symbolic. Symbolic is always built with oppositions. That's what Lacanian problem was. It's in image that oppositions become blurred. And that is why he identified fantasy and imaginary with ego, not with in that sense, with the unconscious. So he didn't say that state of no difference is the unconscious. It's not. Unconscious is structured like a language. Unconscious has oppositions built into it. It's the ego in which all of it fades down. And when these differences get phased down in the ego, they appear back in the real. That's the paranoid knowledge that you inhabit. The paranoia, the hallucinations, the delusions, those come from there. Then how do we? Then the challenge becomes that when we are thinking about this maximal entropy state, and we're thinking that this maximal entropy state will give us some kind of economy of engagement with phenomenon. If I'm getting Ebert right over here, I may be wrong in interpreting him. That economy might not, in many ways, hold out this in some senses, the challenge that is posed to it through the psychosis problem or the ego issue, in the image problem in some senses, the trapped in your own image question. And how do we think through that? I'm just sort of raising these as questions in many ways. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Cheetah. I'll give it to Alex Ebert now. Like, there is an interesting. So Luber left, and I was going to say that there's something about death that brings to light theme, because you realize your life is finite. So it frames it, you know, in that Heideggerian sense. And there's always this weird paradox where, you know, Wittgenstein says death is not a thing in life, and yet doesn't that mean your life is infinite, right? Because, you know, the thing that makes it finite is not in the thing, and yet that doesn't work either. So there's this weird double move that goes on with death, that it's almost like the problem is thinking death too linearly, as opposed to as a dynamic paradox like that. It is the thing that makes your life finite. The thing that completes your life is something you never experience, that's not even in your life. And so your life is both complete and incomplete at the same time. And what does it mean to hold and condition yourself according to that kind of paradox in that way? And then it's almost, and then like there's something about that seems interesting, but I'm going to pass it to Mr. Ebert and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Ebert, please.
Yeah, I have to pick up my kid, so I'll try and just, I'm late to pick her up, but she likes when I pick her up late. That's her words. So I'm just going to I'm going to throw them back at her as soon as I see her. Death drive is more accurately, in my view, described as an equilibrium drive, and it's even more accurately just described as the mechanics of the dialectic. Once people nobody fucking remembers that the dialectic includes sublation, and nobody remembers that sublation is actually alpha bung, and nobody fucking ever remembers that alpha bung means preservation and annihilation. Nobody remembers this, and nobody remembers that Hegel uses the term equilibrium to describe every goddamn sublation there is, and that self-relating negativity, which is again boredom, is what starts the oscillation to create the next oscillation, which again begins with a negativity, then a positivity, in which the repulsion, self-repulsion is how he describes it. So I'm in my equilibrium now. I'm self-repulsed. I'm bored. I don't fucking like myself this way. I'm self-repulsed. I go into another oscillation where, as he says, the attraction wins out and the oscillation becomes quicker and quicker. And then you have another equilibrium. And then you get bored again and you self-repulse again. This is the death drive. It's the drive toward sequential equilibriums, one after the other. Now, it could be, I want to be a doctor, static object, doctor. I've achieved it. The mountain is a plateau. Now I'm dissatisfied. I become the next thing, or I go crazy because I want to hold on to it, or a fundamentalist. And I don't want to get to the next peak. And then I just want to stay here. All of these things can occur. They're all the death drive. The death drive is confusing strictly on sort of like Wittgensteinian terms. It's the word death confuses everyone. What we're actually talking about is non-dynamical states, equilibriums. That's it. And what that is and how that occurs is just the dialectic. That's it. Anyway, I just wanted to say that, and then I'm split. I'm throwing down the gauntlet and I'm splitting. But it's so nice to join you guys, and loved what everyone had to say.
No, I think that's very good. I mean, the problem is death is a metaphor. Like, and the issue is if death is like with the Wittgenstein idea, it frames life, but it's not in life, then the word death can't mean what we think it means. And that's the issue. Like, you have all of these languages built upon things that then create an impression, but the impression leads to not really getting that mechanism that you describe in the paper you did in the Enter the Alien. That's so good. I think that's very important. And then again, I think this has all contributed, frankly, to us not having a tragic vision, a trade-off of competing birds, rather be an economic sociology, because we don't have a movement that is at the central of our thought. We have an either or that is at the center of our thought, and that becomes very problematic. Please.
Can I say one more thing? Someone just mentioned, does equilibrium mean what we think it means? So I just want to say something about that, and then also something about what Javier was saying. Remembering internal and external is so crucial to equilibrium. We're talking about equilibrium within a system, within the boundaries of a system, meaning saturation, indeterminacy within a system, which, by the way, makes that system more determinate with regard to its relationship to the external world. Okay, so like if an alien was to be like, that's humanity, and someone's like, what is humanity? Oh, it's this big mumbo jumbo thing of a whole bunch of different people who have differing opinions. I don't really know how to describe it, right? That's a fairly indeterminate interaction phenomenologically that humanity has with the rest of the solar system, the rest of the galaxy. But if humanity is a fully sublated equilibrium, totally homogenized, all act the same, they're like a eusocial beehive, then the alien says, that's humanity. And it interacts more determinately then, phenomenologically, with the rest of the alien world, because everybody knows that, meaning that specific thing, that behavior is humanity. And I know exactly what humanity is, they do that. Suddenly, the internal homogenization, which creates an internal systemic indeterminacy, is more determinately interacting with the external world. So anyway, and then just in terms of equilibrium, I don't know, we grow up with biology and these sorts of things. We're like, oh, an animal that is living in harmony with the world, that's an animal living in equilibrium with its environment. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about thermal equilibrium. We're talking about more of like a scientific physical sense of the word equilibrium. We're talking about a more harmonic frequency-based term, concept of equilibrium. Anyway, all right, love you guys.
That's excellent. We love you, Mr. Ebert, and thank you for your time today. I think for me, and I'll pass it to Javier here, is like basically what's so difficult is, if I speak very generally, the human understands through algebra, but reality is geometric. And so like you can't move, if you move a piece over here, you also move a piece over there. Like you can't talk about death without also changing the meaning of life, and life without death. Every piece affects every other piece because it's all in a meta-geometrical situation, as Leibniz would put. But the brain can't think that way. Like the brain works by thinking like, well, understanding. Reason is much more geometrical. So everything becomes very... So this then I guess would be the question. I'll give it to Javier. If you do philosophy to where, you can't live in reason, you'd go crazy if you did. You have to use understanding or picture thought or whatever. But does just even knowing that condition your phenomenology to change how you experience the world? And if the answer is yes, and that is something that is a skill outside of market forces, then we can start to see this kind of phenomenological conditioning as the operations of culture outside of the market that has something to do with us maintaining humanity beyond disablement, in the way that Ivan Illich is putting it. So I think the geometrical language that Mr. Ebert was pointing out is very important. And then again, Leibniz was screaming at Descartes. He's like, if we base all of philosophy on algebra, we're going to just end with like these searches for some X variable, some transcendent X variable, and we're not going to know how to live, dang it. And so that debate between Leibniz and Descartes is fascinating, as you know, with the Science and Logic conference. But let me pass it to Javier Rivera, and then I fear I will have to go in a little bit, but if we have any final thoughts, please, let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, this notion of death drive is, what gets complicated is like, there's a lot of people like Julie Resch that don't, and other people that don't agree, or like, we don't all have a uniform understanding or agreement with the idea of death drive, which makes it even more complicated. But I will say that for Julie, death drive is just the implicit failure of everything. So in my opinion, when Ebert talks about equilibrium, he's talking about the fact that we always realize our incompleteness at the state at which we thought would be the end. Right? And that's why it's a sort of like sublimation, preservation kind of idea, because we always realize at the end that we're incomplete. So it ironically becomes the beginning, where you're simultaneously holding the beginning and the end. It's because you are fundamentally incomplete. And so that is, in my opinion, that is death drive for Julie. It's just this sort of implicit, imminent failure of everything, where even the discussion of this topic, we end up coming across, as much as we try to revive it, a point of annihilation or a point of an aporia. Now, Does this mean that we should stop thinking about it, stop conversing about it? No. But I think this is the sort of natural phenomenological experience of new ways of dying that is happening. Because when we actually think about this, when Chetan raised the point of like, we have to think about possibly new ways of dying, we can't prescribe the new ways of dying. That's the danger. That is some of the homogenation that happens, and Shran kind of talks about this too, where he's like, we can entertain all new ways of dying, but we can't prescribe it. So then it ends up just collapsing onto itself and becoming death again. And so we have this aporia here, where it's like we have death on one side, and then we on the other side we have this, the ways of dying, and yet they can't be prescribed. So it seems to be that every time we have to reach this limit of thought where we die in a new way that was unanticipated. And I think that is something similar to what Ebert was talking about with, we have to go with the flow, but that going with the flow can't be a prescription in itself. It has to be a kind of like, oh shit, I discover I can't go against it, you know what I mean? And then you die that way, and then you start realizing like, okay, I can't ever go against the current. So then you start dying that way in a new way. And then you start getting more adventurous, like maybe I can hold on to a rock as I go against the flow. And then you feel like, oh yeah, I can't hold on to that rock anymore, so I have to just let go. And so there's all these simultaneous ideas that are positivistic that end up going back to annihilation, where it's not necessarily nihilistic, but it presents itself as nihilistic because fundamentally the subject is incomplete. And so it has to present itself as supposed equilibriums, states, has to present itself as a dialectic because, well, we're incomplete beings, but we always come back to that side of death that we want to avoid. But that avoidance of death, I would say, is simply the emergence of the novelty of a new way of dying, I would say, which cannot be prescribed, but should be embraced. But of course, we can't prescribe that embraceness. So I feel like we fall back again to like, well, just go with the flow. So I agree with Chetan's point about this hesitation about accelerating, because it would just simply be one way of dying that again can't be prescribed as a universal, like, let's just all drive to our death, accelerate this technology to get to a new point, because then that would actually go against what even Shran would say, that we can't even prescribe new ways of dying. It all collapses into our fear of death, what death we think looks like.
No, I'll give it to Chetan and Jason. And it should be, no, what's tricky is like, there's like go with the flow, which is kind of this arbitrary leaf in the wind, but then it's almost like go with a response, go responding, be able to be in a state of responding. It's not where you're just kind of pulled with, but you're conditioned to respond to. And that seems to have some sort of training. I agree. Death drive to some people means self-sabotage. Death drive means ultimate failure to others. One of the reasons why, for me, I had to do, we did in the distinction between effacement and negation is because there seems to be, and we'll talk about the effacement drive, then we'll talk about the kind of that very state of the equilibrium then has the human have to make a choice on if they respond to that in a dynamic way, thus it's sublative. But I think it has to, I guess I put a lot of emphasis on choice. I think you can reach an equilibrium and stay there and not respond dynamically, and thus it becomes an effacement. That's what's, to me, tricky. We'll emphasize almost the Schrodinger's choice that kind of comes in these equilibrium states that then determines it could be a negation sublation, but it actually could also be an effacement. There's a double thing that then for me gets into the human agency and the absolute choice and all that. But I do sometimes wonder if death drive has almost become like Jesus. If you say Jesus, that's such a compressed notion that contains so much to so many different people. Like, it's hard to know what you're like. Likewise, death drive seems to be a very compressed meme package. And I know Ebert has talked about, religion being a compressed information structure. I sometimes wonder that as well. But let me give it to Chetan and Jason. So Chetan, please.
It won't be fair to talk about Ebert's points behind his back, but let's do it anyway. Let's hurt him like this. He went away. Yeah, given the fact that it's not fair, but yeah. So one of the things that we need to think about is that equilibrium is not simply static. It is a dynamic equilibrium possible in that. And in fact, when we think about questions of incompleteness at the end of the equilibrium cycle, that means you're reaching some form of dynamic equilibrium. It's not simply static equilibrium. Otherwise, system would simply close down on itself. The reason why in Hegel, and that is where different forms of interpretation of Hegel becomes important here, regardless of that challenge in that sense. Second, I think Javi's point is absolutely I think right in that sense that we have to find new ways to die. When we're talking about this question of newness over here, and as I said, hinted last time, we should qualify it with something here in some senses. That is this newness simply an imaginary function, or is it something which is in symbolic order? Because if it is in symbolic order, you have to affirm the negentropic side of symbolic. Symbolic domain is essentially negentropic. That we've always said that human judgment is negentropic, human indifference, bringing into language, so on and so forth. Because symbolic domain actually necessarily brings something within the sphere of oppositions. It places within the sphere of oppositions. Yeah, if you look at Hegel's Science of Logic, that's what he's essentially, getting at there also. It is the imaginary where the fiction gets removed, where it gets slippery, where you can just move fast and fast within the same cycle, isn't it? So, regardless of words, again, topic and entropic, I think for us over here, it can be simply a question of whether the symbolic domain is important within this cycles of, and dead drive, eventually, if you go back to dead drive formulation, Freud saw that both Thanos and Eros, death and life, can be encapsulated as part of death itself. That is what the insight was. That for death drive was not this exclusion of life from death, which is what it would become if we simply, for Freud, the insight was that death drive was postulated as a phenomenon where both death and life could be part of the same drive. That's the insight with which this process started. The problem becomes when we exclude either death or life from this drive. And we want to do that. Our instinct is either we exclude death from this drive and only keep life over there, hunky-dory, or what we do is the reverse. We exclude life from it and we only want death in it. And both those formulations don't work. Both those formulations escape the symbolic domain. Because symbolic domain sort of exists through this traversal of dead drive to its other in some senses. Language emerges within this circulation of dead drive through its other. When dead drive sort of articulates itself in its other, it's from that language sort of grammar finds its roots. So the challenge is to think of both life and death within one drive. Whatever name you want to give to that drive is whatever. I don't mind that, but to include both of them, and to include both of them, you need to find the right oppositions in which this structure has to be placed. It cannot be something which can be done without very particular and contextual understanding and a response, as you said, to the times you are living in. It cannot be a general response, oh, we need to get to the end. It has to be a very particular response, which has to come from a particular diagnosis, particular understanding of the moment you are at. It cannot derive from a general tendency of the dead drive itself. It has to be derived from the particular context through which we are sort of inhabiting this world that we are inhabiting. And I think that's the challenge that which I was facing with this development. Yeah.
I think it was very well put. I'll give it to Jason. Yeah, I sometimes like to almost think about the irony drive, where humans are like fundamentally ironic because precisely the things that they do for life lead to death, death leads to life, and it's all kind of upside down. I think also the great problem we have is we cannot discuss situation. We can only discuss points, but reality is a situation. And this also hints at where literature and story comes from. Like Walker Percy once said, a novel is basically a point that can be said no other way. Like it's an emotion that can be said no other way. When you look at human beings, only descriptions of situations will do. But I ain't got time for that. I gotta get to work, you know? So we're stuck in the understanding because reason, well, even the word reason sounds like you understand reason, right? Like you have to do this weird thinking that's trying to approach situation as you talk. How the frick do you do that? And I think the human is structured in their being to be ironic. That's the thing we like to emphasize. There's irony that describes the human being. So you always have to be watching out for that. You always have to be aware. And again, I think there's also like when McGowan, you know, Dr. McGowan in Emancipation from Hegel emphasizes kind of the death drive in the phenomenology. I do wonder, you know, is what death drive in phenomenology, is that what equilibrium is in the logic? You know, there's a kind of way to overlap them. And it does seem that death drive describes equilibrium to the subject. But then when you go to the logic, equilibrium as the structure of being, if you give me that grand phrase, seems different in character. The issue then is, of course, as we know with Hegel, freedom. The human has the ability to choose to stay in equilibrium, right? And in that sense, make it an effacement, precisely because death entails life. And when we choose to try to stay in a death state, it creates a pathology that eats itself because it doesn't make any sense. Like death and life always go together. So if we choose to organize ourselves in reality as if death can be separated from life, that leads to all the pathologies, right? But being itself wouldn't do that. Like the doctrine of being is where, you know, where it talks about the repelling and the equilibrium and all that. Like being itself doesn't have the same choice abilities as human beings. So, you know, the bookcase over there can't make the mistake of trying to reside in, you know, pure equilibrium or pure death as if it's separated from life. But the human can live as if that was possible, which then creates all of the effacement in that way. But I think the point you're getting at, where death and life always come together, I mean, maybe you could capture that paradox if you emphasize the drive, because death drive, death life, drive is life, right? The drive has a life element to it, but eventually the life part of it gets lost from the equation. So I think that's very important. And to me, it gets into the topic to really bring out that double-sidedness is why you should really study irony, self-sabotage, self-deception. All of these things are what to me are utterly, utterly freaking fascinating. Because the human being is able to do something they think is good that isn't. Like, how does the brain work to do these kind of self-sabotages, ironies, all of those? Because those phrases, for me, have the doubleness going on. The double act of life killing itself and killing to live, all of these. But anyway, let me pass it to Jason, and then if anyone has final things to say as we come up on the close. But Jason, please.
Yeah. I'll also agree with Chetan here in that equilibrium is not just one thing. You know, it's also equally dynamic. Furthermore, I'll say that I don't think it's particularly helpful to pick and choose which meaning of sublation is the primary starting point. You know, especially if what we're looking for is a truly indeterminate beginning. You know, then it would be indifferent to the contradictory nature of equilibrium, you know, so to speak. I guess I'd like to also talk about the new, you know, like what is the new in relation to this you know, ironic reality of the now, right? The now has passed always, you know, like this is, and so I think here we see the relationship between time and history, so to speak. You know, I think the new is in a way must be in a kind of I don't know, matrix of recollection, so to speak, which is to say we must accept or react to irreversibility, to use a term from I don't know, dynamics, chaos theory. I think I don't remember. I don't quite recall. And just to say that there is a kind of failure of time, you know, there's a kind of falling into a kind of scheme, into a historical thing, in which we can say something is genuinely new, or if something is, you know, for example, if we merely repeat the cycle of boredom, if I go from this point and then I reach another point, I'm bored, reach another point, I'm bored, there's something spurious there. And can we even say that there is something new in what you're doing, or are you just repeating something? Whereas if we are in, as I used the term earlier, a matrix of recollection, we can see, there is my shape before, my shape now, and the shape before that, and which shape am I okay with? Which shape am I ashamed of? I think there's a lot of things, for instance, regarding childhood memories, which still plague the adult. Like our particular shape, or of our whole totality. In this matrix I talk of. So I'm using a lot of crazy words just now. I think I'll stop right here. Sorry. Thank you.
One of our favorite pastimes at the net, Jason, is to use a lot of crazy words, as many
Yeah.
crazy words as possible. So please, I really like the phrase matrix.
I don't get to use them often.
That's why we're here. So the conditioning of our experience, like go. So I love the phrase matrix of recollection. That's really, really lovely. And I think that, so again, like Holgate will emphasize that the phenomenology is not philosophy. It's a phenomenology for Hegel, or say it's a lot where the logic is a logic, right? And the weird thing is, if humans have something like freedom, we're able to treat an equilibrium state that is actually not non-dynamical, that actually is dynamic. We can choose to be toward it as if it's non-dynamical. And that contradiction in a bad way, that causes the effacement. And that's why I guess the distinction for effacement is big, is we can choose to be toward reality in a way that is not correct. And this causes the pathologies. Like we need to, in our phenomenology, choose to treat equilibrium as dynamic because it actually is dynamic. The problem is we can choose not to do that. And arguably, if we follow the depth drive in one sense, we have a drive not to do that because there's something about the brain that wants to simplify and to save energy, just like Ebert was saying. So a lot of the irony, and then I'll give it to Javier here, like the emphasis of irony in the truism of the rational is that what we phenomenologically are toward doing is against how reality is. And so we naturally end up conflicting, and that leads to the effacement. That leads to the pathologies and different things. And so that irony, like the key irony is the way reality is how we're phenomenology, is how we are not naturally phenomenologically toward. So there has to be a conditioning. There has to be an awareness of that. But of course, how do you gain awareness of that is if your very phenomenological experience doesn't present that to you. So there's a concealing of that break that then if you don't, how do you see it? Exactly. Well, that's for Hegel abstract, you have to have the thought, right? But then maybe you're a crazy person. So, but let me give it to Javier Rivera, please. Javier! Oh, there he is. Yeah, I can hear you. I was going to sing to you until you came back.
No, yeah. So I think this is such a funny point on the pathologies and everything, because I think when we talked about homogenization, some of its dangers, it's I think the irony is realizing that the homogenization point is impossible to reside in. It would just simply be death. But I think where the pathology occurs is this belief in the idea that we can monopolize that point of homogenization, that we actually believe that we can reside in that point of homogenization. And this is why I found really fascinating about the concept of new ways of dying, is that ironically, the new ways of dying is fundamentally acknowledging or realizing that the point of homogenization is fundamentally impossible. But like Chetan was talking about, it's always set in a particular context and time. So it is ironically a new way of dying. There's something about the newness that is a failure in itself, which is why it's new, because it's a failure rather than a progressive success, that we end up realizing oh, we can't reside in this point of homogenization. It's actually impossible, because the only way to reside in it is actually death itself. It's utter annihilation. But so long as we think that we can, which we probably always will, because if it needs to be dynamic, we need to constantly, because I think what's the aporia that ends up happening is, well, what is the homogenization point, right? So you kind of have to self-discover what is that supposed homogenization point, and then realize, oh, that's not what it is. So it's like this weird thing where it's like we're constantly driving towards this homogenization point, thinking that we're finally going to get there. And then when we do get there, supposedly it's not what it is. And that's when we start realizing that the homogenization point is fundamentally impossible. But we need to continue to believe that it's possible in order to ironically discover new ways of dying. So it's like, it's such an aporia that even for me to prescribe it would be ridiculous, to be like, okay, we need to always discover what the homogenization point is. Well, the thing is, we don't know what it is until we place ourselves in the context of time and history and then try to respond to it. And then by the failure of our responses, we go, oh, that's the new way of dying. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
No, I think that's lovely put. And alas, I will have to run, but there's something ironic, fundamentally ironic about history and human beings. So, like, if we use my AAAB language, we need AA to approach AB, but AA makes AB not there. And if AA is how you got to AB, why would you stop trusting AA? Like, if understanding is needed to get to reason, why would you think understanding's not enough? Because it helped you get to reason, right? Likewise, so there's like, we are toward, as subjects, we are toward reality as AA, but reality is AB. So we're prone to all of these mistakes. And that's why I think Hegel also emphasizes like fear of error is the fear of truth, because you have to go through the error of your own phenomenology to get at actuality. But why would you do that? And if your own phenomenology is what caused the mistake, then isn't it just going to screw you again? This is why, like, belief and conditioning of experience, like once you know about AB, can that condition your phenomenology to experience reality in different ways? That seems to be a very big question. I think like residing on the harmonic, where everything is the same. That's exactly the mistake. And to me, that's why I like the language of underfitting and overfitting almost more than right and wrong. It's not that the sameness is wrong, but there's a point where it does become wrong, where you're residing in it too long and now it overfits. It's not that death is bad, but there is a point where you're overfitting its application, or maybe you're underfitting your application. But this then is why, if we think of philosophy as a skill, it goes back to the cooking idea. Like, we have to be able to tell when we're overfitting and when we're underfitting. But the only way to get to the place where we can tell that is precisely to risk overfitting or underfitting, right? Like, you have to risk the death to get to the place where you can see new ways to die. So you always have to play with fire. Like, in a sense, there's no such thing as not playing with fire. And philosophy is a kind of examination of that reality. Like, if thought naturally makes reality AA, but the only way to get at AB is thought, then the only way to get at AB is precisely the risk of losing the AB. So there's no way not to play with fire. And again, this emphasis of Illich on like skills that like the skills of accepting the reality that you always must play with fire. These don't seem to get you a job. These don't seem to be within wage labor, but it is what we need to kind of cultivate in spaces outside the market, or else we're going to end up in these mistakes, either because we totally avoid death in a way that becomes problematic, like a fear of death, or maybe we embrace death in a way that is self-effacing, or maybe because we can't tell when we're overfitting and underfitting death. There's like 3 different mistakes there that you could get into. And instead, it seems to be this right reasoning about life, death that we have to be capable of. Well, that seems to be a skill that seems to be quite a difficult undertaking, and it's natural for us to screw it up, to not have that skill. And so I'm glad everyone's here so we can work on how to live and survive this life where we must play with fire. So thank you, everyone. Glad we could play with fire today.